There are promises born in blood and snow. Those are the most dangerous kind because they never let you forget. February 15th, 1885. The blizzard came down from the mountains like the hand of God reaching to crush everything beneath it. Caleb Reed had seen storms before. 15 winters working the high country ranches of Wyoming Territory had taught him to read weather the way other men read scripture. But this one felt different. This one felt like judgment. The wind howled through the darkness, turning the world into a fury of white that stole breath and sight and sense of direction. Caleb's horse moved forward through instinct more than guidance, picking its way across ground that had disappeared beneath 2 feet of fresh powder. Ice crystals cut at his face like tiny knives. His beard had frozen solid an hour ago. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, even inside thick leather gloves. He had been searching for 3 hours. The cattle had scattered when the storm hit, and Thomas Brennan had gone after a group that broke toward the ravine. That was the last anyone had seen of him. Caleb had volunteered to search the northern quadrant, knowing in his gut that something had gone wrong. Thomas was careful. Thomas knew these ranges as well as anyone. If he hadn't come back yet, it meant he couldn't. The horse stopped suddenly, ears pricking forward. Caleb squinted through the driving snow and saw a dark shape ahead. Not moving. His heart dropped into his stomach as he dismounted and stumbled forward through drifts that came up to his knees. Thomas lay crumpled against a boulder, his leg twisted at an angle that made Caleb's gut clench. Blood had soaked through his pants and frozen into the snow beneath him, creating a grotesque sculpture of red ice. His face was the color of old paper lips, blue eyes half closed. The horse stood nearby, reins trailing patient despite the storm. Caleb dropped to his knees beside his friend, hands already moving to check for breath, for pulse, for any sign that he wasn't too late. Thomas's chest rose and fell, barely each breath shallow and rattling. The wound in his thigh was bad, deep, the kind of injury that killed a man slowly if the cold didn't take him first. "Caleb," Thomas's voice came out as barely a whisper, nearly lost in the wind. His eyes opened, finding focus with obvious effort. "Thought maybe you'd miss me in all this white." "I got you." Caleb pulled off his own coat, wrapping it around Thomas, even though he knew it wouldn't be enough. The cold immediately bit through his shirt, but he ignored it. "We need to get you warm, get you to town." "Don't!" Thomas's hand shot out, gripping Caleb's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't waste time on false comfort. We both know how this ends." And Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Thomas would be fine, that they'd get him to a doctor, and everything would work out. But he had learned long ago not to traffic in comfortable lies. The wound was too deep. The cold was too brutal. They were miles from shelter. Even if Caleb could somehow get Thomas onto a horse, the ride would kill him before they reached town. "There's something you need to know." Thomas's breathing was labored now, each word costing him. His grip on Caleb's wrist tightened. "Something I should have told you before. Something important." The wind screamed around them, driving snow into their faces, stealing what little warmth their bodies still generated. Caleb leaned closer, trying to shield Thomas from the worst of it. "There's a woman, Margaret Morrison, lives back east in Pennsylvania." Thomas coughed and blood flecked his lips. "We've been writing letters for 2 years. I promised her a future here. Promised I'd send for her come spring." Caleb's mind raced, trying to understand why Thomas was telling him this now. Thomas had never mentioned any woman, any correspondence, any plans for marriage. They'd worked together for years, shared bottles and stories and long nights watching cattle under endless stars. If Thomas had been planning to marry, Caleb would have known, should have known. "I need you to promise me something." Thomas's eyes were intense despite the pain, holding Caleb's gaze with desperate focus. "Find her. Marry her yourself. Don't let her come out here expecting a husband and find nothing but a grave." The request hit Caleb like a physical blow. Marriage. The word alone carried weight he'd spent years trying to avoid. He thought of Sarah, of Daniel, of all the ways he'd already failed at being what a family needed. The idea of taking responsibility for another life, another person's hopes and dreams and future, felt like being asked to carry a mountain. "Thomas, I can't. You know I don't. I'm not the right man for that. You're the only man I trust." Thomas coughed again, harder this time, more blood. "Promise me, Caleb. Find Margaret, marry her. Don't let her face this world alone. She's in danger. Don't let him find her first." Something in those last words sent ice down Caleb's spine that had nothing to do with the storm. Him. Who was him? What danger? But Thomas's breathing was getting worse, his grip weakening. "Promise me." The words came out barely audible. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs you. But give me your word. You've never broken a promise in your life. Don't start now." Caleb looked at his friend, at the blood staining the snow, at the life draining from eyes that had always held nothing but loyalty and faith. He thought about the woman waiting back east, expecting letters that would never come, dreaming of a future that had just died in a Wyoming blizzard. "I give you my word," Caleb heard himself say. "I'll find her. I'll marry her. I'll make sure she has the life you promised." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Relief or maybe peace. His hand fell away from Caleb's wrist, dropping into the snow. "Her letters are in my saddlebag. Address is there." Thomas's voice was fading, each word softer than the last. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. Tell her you'll keep it for me. And Caleb, there's something else. Tell her I'm sorry about that night. Tell her I tried to make it right." Caleb wanted to ask what that meant. What night? What had Thomas tried to make right? But Thomas's eyes had closed, his breathing so shallow now that Caleb could barely see his chest move. "Thomas, stay with me. What night? What are you talking about?" But Thomas didn't answer. His breathing grew fainter, fainter, until Caleb couldn't tell if he was breathing at all. He pressed his fingers to Thomas's neck, searching for a pulse. Found one. Weak. Irregular. But there. Not dead. Not yet. But dying. Caleb made a decision in that moment that he would question 1,000 times afterward. He couldn't carry Thomas in this storm, couldn't get him to town alive. But maybe, just maybe, if he could find shelter close by, if he could get Thomas warm and stable, there might be a chance. The old line shack was only a mile south if he could navigate correctly. A mile through a blizzard that had already killed visibility down to nothing. A mile that might as well be 100. He lifted Thomas as carefully as he could, trying not to jar the injured leg. Thomas didn't wake, didn't make a sound. Caleb got him draped across the saddle of his horse, then mounted behind him, one arm around Thomas's unconscious form to keep him from sliding off. Thomas's horse followed as Caleb turned south, trusting his sense of direction and his horse's instinct to find shelter. The ride took forever and no time at all. Caleb lost track of minutes, of distance, of everything except the need to keep moving forward. His hands went numb. His face stopped feeling the cold, which he knew was a bad sign. Thomas's body was dead weight against him, and Caleb couldn't tell if his friend was still breathing. When the line shack appeared out of the white chaos, it felt like a miracle. A small, rough structure that in better weather looked barely habitable. Tonight it looked like salvation. Caleb half fell from his horse, dragging Thomas down with him. He got the door open, pulled Thomas inside, then went back for the horses to get them into the lean-to shelter. Inside the shack, Caleb built a fire with shaking hands that could barely grip the matches. When flame finally caught and began to spread, he turned his attention to Thomas, stripped off the wet, frozen clothes, wrapped him in every blanket he could find, checked the wound which had mercifully stopped bleeding from the cold, did everything he could think of to keep his friend alive. Thomas didn't wake. His breathing remained shallow, his skin cold and waxy. But he was alive, barely, holding on to life by the thinnest of threads. Caleb collapsed near the fire, exhaustion hitting him like a physical force. He should stay awake, should monitor Thomas, should do something useful, but his body had other ideas. His eyes closed against his will, and darkness took him. He dreamed of promises and blood, and a woman's face he'd never seen waiting for a future that might already be dead. When consciousness returned, it came with confusion and disorientation. Caleb was warm, too warm. He opened his eyes to find himself still in the line shack, still near the fire that had burned down to glowing embers. Gray light filtered through the gaps in the walls, speaking of dawn or near it. Thomas lay where Caleb had left him, wrapped in blankets, motionless. For a terrible moment, Caleb thought he was looking at a corpse. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of Thomas's chest, Still alive, still breathing, still here, but unconscious, deeply unconscious in a way that spoke of coma rather than sleep. Caleb checked Thomas's pulse, his breathing, his color. Everything was weak but steady. Stable, if you could call it that. Thomas wasn't dying anymore, but he wasn't waking up either. The storm had passed. Through the door, Caleb could see a world transformed into crystalline, white, beautiful, and deadly. He needed to get Thomas to town to a real doctor, needed to get help. The nearest ranch was 2 miles west. He could ride there, get men to help transport Thomas safely. Before he left, Caleb retrieved Thomas's saddlebag from where he'd dropped it the night before. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather, he found a stack of letters, all addressed to Thomas in a neat, careful hand, all from Margaret Morrison, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He opened the most recent one, knowing he shouldn't read another person's private correspondence, but needing to understand what Thomas had asked him to take on. The letter was dated January 15th, 1885, just a month ago. "Dear Thomas," it began, "your last letter arrived 3 weeks ago, and I've read it so many times the paper is wearing thin at the creases. You write about Wyoming as if it's a promised land, and perhaps for you it is. I confess I find it hard to imagine having never been more than 20 miles from the city where I was born." And Caleb read further, learning about Margaret's work in a textile mill, about her dreams of something better, about her cautious hope that coming west might offer the fresh start she desperately needed. The writing was intelligent, direct, with none of the flowery language women were supposed to use in correspondence. She wrote like someone who'd learned not to waste words. Then, near the end of the letter, a line that made Caleb's blood run cold. "I need to tell you something important. The man I mentioned before, the one I thought was dead, he's looking for me. Someone saw him in the city last week asking questions. I'm frightened, Thomas. If he finds me before I can leave, I don't know what will happen. Please, if the offer still stands, tell me to come now. I can't wait until spring. I need to disappear before he tracks me down." Caleb read the passage 3 times, trying to understand. Who was this man? Why was Margaret running? What had she meant when she thought he was dead? He dug deeper into the saddlebag and found another letter, older, from 6 months prior. This one was more explicit. The man's name was Victor Morrison. And he wasn't just someone from Margaret's past. According to her letter, Victor Morrison was her husband, or had been. Margaret wrote about him in past tense as someone who was supposed to be gone dead, removed from her life. But apparently, Victor had survived whatever Margaret thought had killed him. And now, he was looking for her. Caleb sat back, his mind racing. Thomas had asked him to marry a woman who might already be married, a woman running from something or someone dangerous, a woman who'd written, "I can't run forever," like someone who knew her time was running out. What had Thomas gotten him into? And more importantly, what had Thomas known that he hadn't shared? Caleb looked at his unconscious friend lying silent and still unable to answer any questions. He thought about the promise he'd made in the snow, in the moment of desperation and grief. A promise to find Margaret, to marry her, to protect her. From whom Thomas had said, "Don't let him find her first." That made it sound like a race, like Margaret's safety depended on speed as much as anything else. Caleb made his decision. He would keep his promise to Thomas. But first, he needed to get his friend to safety, needed to understand exactly what situation he was walking into, needed to figure out how to protect a woman he'd never met from a danger he didn't fully understand. He left the shack and rode for help. 2 days later, Thomas Brennan lay in a bed at the town doctor's office, still unconscious, still barely clinging to life. The doctor, a weathered man named Harrison, who'd seen his share of frontier injuries, gave his assessment with characteristic bluntness. He might wake up, he might not. The body's in shock, the mind's gone somewhere else. Could be hours, could be weeks, could be never. I've seen men come back from worse. I've seen men die from less. Nothing to do now but wait. Caleb couldn't wait. Every day that passed was another day Victor Morrison might be closing in on Margaret. Another day, she was vulnerable, alone, unprotected. He went back to his cabin, a small, rough structure on the edge of Samuel Garrett's Broken Creek Ranch, where he worked as foreman. The cabin was sparse, functional, the home of a man who'd learned to live with solitude. 1 room, 1 bed, a stove, a table, shelves for supplies, and the few books he owned. It had been his sanctuary for 3 years, since Sarah died, since everything fell apart. Before he wrote to Margaret, there was something he needed to do, someone he needed to see. The house was small, tidy, on the edge of town, where respectable widows lived quiet lives. Mrs. Eleanor Harlow answered the door with flour on her hands and a tired smile on her weathered face. "Caleb, I wasn't expecting you until Sunday. I know, I'm sorry. I need to see Daniel." She stepped aside, letting him in. From the kitchen came the sound of a child's laughter, bright and clear, the kind of sound that could break your heart if you let it. Daniel Reed was 5 years old, small for his age, but sturdy, with dark hair that curled at the ends and eyes the exact shade of brown his mother's had been. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a slate carefully copying letters Mrs. Harlow had written for him to practice. When he saw Caleb, his whole face lit up. "Papa." The word hit Caleb the way it always did, with love and guilt in equal measure. He opened his arms, and Daniel flew into them, small body colliding with his chest, arms wrapping tight around his neck. "Hello, son." Caleb held him close, breathing in the smell of soap, and little boy feeling the warmth of life and trust and unconditional love. All the things he didn't deserve. They sat together on the floor while Daniel showed Caleb his letters, his drawings, his collection of interesting rocks he'd found in Mrs. Harlow's garden. Normal things, happy things. The kind of childhood Caleb wanted desperately to give him, but didn't know how. Mrs. Harlow made tea and left them alone, understanding in her quiet way that this was a father and son who needed time together, even if neither of them quite knew how to navigate it. "Papa, when can I come live with you?" Daniel asked the question he always asked, hope bright in his eyes. "Mrs. Harlow is nice, but I want to be with you." It was the question that haunted Caleb's dreams, the guilt that never left him. After Sarah died, after the baby died with her, Caleb had looked at his 3-year-old son and seen only his own failure. Sarah had died bringing a second child into the world, a child Caleb had put inside her, despite knowing the risks. The doctors had warned them after Daniel's birth. Another pregnancy might be dangerous. They should wait, be careful, maybe not try again at all. But they had tried. Caleb had wanted to give Daniel a brother or sister, had wanted Sarah to have the large family she dreamed of, and Sarah had died screaming, bleeding, begging for it to stop, while Caleb held her hand and promised her everything would be fine when they both knew it was a lie. He couldn't be a father after that. Couldn't look at Daniel without seeing Sarah. Couldn't imagine raising a child alone when he'd already proven he couldn't keep the people he loved safe. Mrs. Harlow had offered to take Daniel temporarily just until Caleb got back on his feet. That had been 3 years ago. "Soon," Caleb said the same lie he always told. "Soon, I promise." But this time saying the word promise made him think of Thomas, of the vow he'd made in the snow, of the woman coming from Pennsylvania who had no idea what she was walking into. After Daniel fell asleep that evening, Caleb spoke with Mrs. Harlow in her small parlor. "I need to ask you something. It's going to sound strange." She poured tea with steady hands, a woman who'd raised 6 children of her own and buried a husband who'd seen enough of life not to be shocked by much. "Try me. I'm getting married." Her eyebrows rose, but she said nothing, waiting for the rest. "It's complicated. Thomas Brennan, you know, he's in the doctor's office, barely alive. Before the storm, he'd been corresponding with a woman back east, planning to marry her. He asked me to take his place, to marry her myself, to protect her. Protect her from what? I'm not entirely sure, but she's running from someone dangerous. She needs a husband for legal protection, for safety. I promised Thomas I'd do it." Mrs. Harlow sipped her tea, studying him over the rim of the cup. "And you're telling me this because I haven't told her about Daniel, about being a widower, about having a son. I'm afraid if I do, she won't come. And Thomas was very clear that time matters, that she needs to get away from wherever she is, whoever she's running from." "So you're planning to marry a woman under false pretenses?" Caleb flinched at the bluntness of it. "When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it is." "How does it sound when you say it?" He had no good answer for that. It was deception, plain and simple. The kind of thing he'd always despised in other men. But what choice did he have? Margaret needed help now, not after lengthy explanations and negotiations. And if she knew about Daniel, knew about his failures as a husband and father, she might refuse, might decide to take her chances with whatever danger she was fleeing. "I know it's wrong," Caleb said quietly, "but I gave Thomas my word, and that woman needs protection. I can't help her if she won't come." Mrs. Harlow set down her teacup. "You're asking my permission to continue keeping Daniel a secret. I'm asking you to keep taking care of him, just a while longer, until I can figure out how to tell Margaret the truth without scaring her away. And if she doesn't accept him, if she refuses to be stepmother to a child you didn't tell her about, then I'll find another way, but at least she'll be safe. At least she'll be away from whoever's hunting her." Mrs. Harlow was quiet for a long moment. "You're a good man, Caleb Reed, but you're also a fool. Secrets like this have a way of destroying the very thing you're trying to protect. Tell her the truth. In your first letter, tell her everything. Give her the choice. And if she says no, then you find another way to help her. But you don't start a marriage with a lie. Trust me on that. I've been married. I know." Caleb wanted to take her advice, wanted to be the kind of man who did the right thing even when it was hard. But the memory of Thomas's words kept echoing in his mind. Don't let him find her first. Time mattered. Speed mattered. Every day he delayed might be the day Victor Morrison tracked Margaret down. "I'll think about it," he said, which they both knew meant no. That night, back in his cabin, Caleb sat at his small table with paper and pen, trying to find words for an impossible letter. How did you write to a stranger and ask her to marry you? How did you explain that her intended was in a coma, possibly dying, and you were the replacement? How did you convince her to trust you when you were already starting with deception? He wrote draft after draft, crumpling papers and starting over. Too formal, too casual, too much information, not enough. The fire burned low and went out. The lamp oil ran low. Outside the world stayed dark and cold. Finally, as dawn began to gray the windows, Caleb wrote the letter he would send. "Miss Morrison, I am writing to inform you that Thomas Brennan was severely injured in a blizzard 3 weeks ago. He is alive but unconscious, and the doctors cannot say if he will recover. Before he lost consciousness, he asked me to contact you and to make you an offer. My name is Caleb Reed. I have worked with Thomas for many years, and he was my closest friend. He made me promise to ensure your safety and to offer you the future he promised. A life in Wyoming free from whatever troubles you face in Pennsylvania, and a marriage based on partnership and protection rather than romance. I understand this must seem unusual, a stranger offering to honor another man's promise. But Thomas was very clear about the urgency of your situation. He said you were in danger and needed to leave quickly. I am making this offer because I honor my word. If you choose to come west, I will marry you. I will offer you a home protection and partnership. I will not offer you romance or poetry. I don't know how to give those things. But I can offer you my word that I will never harm you, never prevent you from pursuing your own interests, and never treat you as anything less than an equal. If you choose not to come, I will understand. But if you need safety, if you need to disappear from whatever threatens you in Pennsylvania, the offer stands. I have enclosed money for train fare and an address where you can reach me. Whatever you decide, I wish you well and hope you find the safety you seek. Caleb Reed." He read it 3 times, changing a word here and there, then sealed it before he could second-guess himself further. He added all the money he'd saved over the past year. Enough for train fare and then some. Enough to give her options. The letter went out on Monday's mail coach. Caleb returned to work, throwing himself into the physical demands of ranch life to avoid thinking about what he'd set in motion. Winter was hard on the cattle. Fences needed constant repair. Ice had to be broken on water troughs every morning. The work was brutal and endless, and exactly what he needed. Jake Wilson found him 3 days later mending fence in the north pasture. "You look like hell," Jake observed with his usual tact. "Feel like it too. Heard about Thomas. Heard he's still out cold. That's rough." Caleb hammered a post back into frozen ground, not trusting himself to speak. "Also heard something else. Heard you sent a letter back east. To some woman Thomas was planning to marry." Jake leaned against the fence, studying Caleb with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "You planning to marry her yourself?" Small towns had no secrets. Caleb should have known word would spread. "Thomas asked me to, made me promise." That's a hell of a promise to make, marrying a stranger to honor a dying friend's request. He's not dead yet, but he might be. And then you're married to a woman you don't know, don't love, bound by obligation to a ghost's last wish. You really think that's a good idea? Caleb drove the post deeper with more force than necessary. I gave my word. Jake was quiet for a moment, then softer. This about Sarah? About trying to prove you can do right by someone this time? The words hit closer to truth than Caleb wanted to admit. This is about keeping a promise, nothing more. If you say so. But Caleb, you can't fix what happened with Sarah by sacrificing yourself to some stranger's problems. That's not redemption. That's just another way of punishing yourself. I'm not asking for your opinion. No, but I'm giving it anyway. You're a good man. You deserve better than a marriage of obligation. And that woman, whoever she is, she deserves better than a husband who's only doing it out of guilt. Caleb threw down his hammer and faced Jake directly. Thomas said she was in danger. Said someone was hunting her. Said I needed to marry her to protect her legally. That's not obligation, that's basic decency. Jake's expression shifted. What kind of danger? I don't know exactly, but she's running from someone, and time matters. Then you're not just taking on a wife, you're taking on her enemies too. Whatever trouble she's carrying, it's going to land on your doorstep the moment she arrives. I know. And you're doing it anyway. I gave my word. Jake shook his head slowly. You're either the most honorable man I've ever met, or the biggest fool, maybe both. He paused. You told her about Daniel. The question hung in the cold air between them. Caleb looked away. You didn't. Caleb, you can't. She needs to get here safely first. I'll tell her after. After you're married, after she's trapped. That's not fair to her. Nothing about this situation is fair, but at least she'll be alive. There was nothing more to say. Jake helped him finish the fence, and they worked in silence. Two men who'd known each other long enough not to need words for everything. The response came 2 weeks later. Caleb had almost convinced himself that Margaret wouldn't write back, that she'd seen through his inadequate letter, and decided to take her chances elsewhere. When the postmaster handed him the envelope with Margaret Morrison's handwriting, his hands actually shook. He didn't open it in town. Rode back to his cabin, built up the fire, sat at his table, and stared at the sealed paper for a full 10 minutes before finding the courage to break the wax. Mr. Reed, I received your letter and have spent considerable time weighing your offer. My first instinct was to refuse. The idea of marrying a stranger to honor another man's promise sounds like fiction, not reality. But you are correct about my situation. I am in danger. Time is running short. The person hunting me is getting closer, and I need to leave before he finds me. So, I will accept your offer with conditions. First, I am coming on my own terms with my own resources. I have saved money for this journey and will not arrive in your debt. If our arrangement proves untenable, I need the means to leave. Second, I expect absolute honesty between us. You write that you offer partnership and protection. I need both, but I also need truth. If there are things about yourself, your past, your situation that I should know, I need you to tell me now before I board that train. I will not be trapped by secrets. Third, I need you to understand what you're taking on. The man hunting me is my husband, or was. His name is Victor Morrison. I believed him dead for 2 years. Apparently I was wrong. He is dangerous, obsessive, and will not stop looking for me. If I come to Wyoming, I bring that threat with me. If you cannot accept that risk, tell me now. I am scheduled to arrive in Wyoming on March 15th on the afternoon train. If you meet me at the station, I will know you meant what you wrote. If you are not there, I will understand and find another way forward. I am trusting your word with my life, Mr. Reed. I hope that trust is not misplaced. Margaret Morrison. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his mind catching on one particular phrase. If there are things about yourself, your past, your situation that I should know, I need you to tell me now. She'd given him an opening, a chance to tell the truth about Daniel, about Sarah, about all the ways he'd already failed at being what a family needed. This was the moment to be honest, to give her all the information before she made her final choice. He picked up his pen, started to write a response explaining about Daniel, about Mrs. Harlow, about the son he'd been too broken to raise properly. But the words wouldn't come. Every sentence felt like an excuse, a justification for moral cowardice. And underneath it all was the fear that if he told her, she wouldn't come. would decide the risk was too great, the situation too complicated, would stay in Pennsylvania and face Victor Morrison alone. Caleb set down the pen and made a choice he would regret for months to come. He would tell her. Just not yet. Not until she was safely here, safely married, safely out of Victor Morrison's reach. Then he would explain about Daniel. Then he would deal with the consequences. He wrote a short response confirming he would meet her on March 15th, mailed it that same day, and tried not to think about Mrs. Harlow's warning that secrets had a way of destroying the very things you were trying to protect. March 15th came with surprising speed and unbearable slowness. The weeks leading up to it passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Caleb cleaned his cabin, tried to make it presentable, for a woman realized he had no idea what that actually meant. He worked longer hours at the ranch, saving every penny against an uncertain future. He visited Daniel every Sunday, still unable to find the words to explain that soon there might be a woman in their lives, a stepmother Daniel didn't know was coming. Thomas remained unconscious, a silent presence in the doctor's office that Caleb visited twice a week. Dr. Harrison said there had been no change. Thomas's body healed slowly, his wounds closed, his color improved, but his eyes stayed shut, his mind somewhere unreachable. Caleb would sit beside the bed and talk to him sometimes, telling him about Margaret's letter, about the plan to marry her as promised. Thomas never responded, never moved, gave no sign he heard or understood. On March 14th, Caleb rode into town and checked into the small hotel, wanting to be close to the train station for Margaret's arrival. He barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd say when he finally met the woman he'd agreed to marry, wondering if she'd take one look at him and change her mind, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or the first right decision in years. March 15, 1885. The afternoon train arrived precisely on time, huffing steam and grinding to a halt, with the screech of metal on metal. Caleb stood on the platform, hat in his hands, heart hammering against his ribs in a way that annoyed him. He was 34 years old, too old to be nervous about meeting a woman. 3 passengers disembarked. A traveling salesman Caleb recognized from previous visits, an older woman immediately claimed by waiting family. And then a third figure stepped down from the train car. Caleb knew her instantly. Knew her the way you know thunder is coming before you hear it, the way you know winter's arrived before the first snowfalls. Something in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she moved, the sharp attention with which she took in her surroundings. Margaret Morrison was taller than he'd expected. Perhaps 5 feet 6 inches slender, but not fragile, wearing a traveling dress of dark gray wool that had seen better days, but was impeccably maintained. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from her face, emphasizing rather than hiding the scars that tracked down the right side of her face and neck. Burn scars exactly as she'd described in her letters, the skin tight and discolored, pulling her mouth slightly at one corner. But it wasn't the scars Caleb noticed first. It was her eyes. Dark brown, almost black, moving constantly, scanning the platform, the buildings, the people watching. Looking for threats, looking for danger. The eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust safety. And there was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine despite the mild spring weather. Her right hand was hidden in the folds of her skirt, but Caleb could see the outline of something held there, something small and sharp. She'd arrived armed and alert, a woman prepared to fight. She saw him watching and met his gaze directly. Held it for a long moment, assessing, measuring. Then she walked toward him with steady steps. "Mr. Reed?" Her voice was lower than he'd imagined. Steady, controlled. But underneath he could hear the strain of long travel and longer fear. "Miss Morrison, welcome to Wyoming." They stood there awkwardly while the train pulled away and the other passengers dispersed. Up close, Caleb could see more details. The shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The way her free hand kept touching a locket at her throat, like checking to make sure it was still there. The slight tremble in her fingers that she was trying to hide. "Did anyone follow you here?" she asked, the question coming out sharp and sudden. "Did anyone ask about me, on the platform in the town, anywhere?" "No, no one's been asking questions." And some of the tension left her shoulders, but not all of it. "You're sure?" I'm sure. Margaret, you're safe here. Whatever you're running from, it's 3,000 miles away." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't know Victor. 3,000 miles means nothing to him. If he wants to find me, he'll find me." The driver had set her luggage on the platform, 2 small trunks and a carpet bag. Everything she owned reduced to what she could carry on a train. Caleb picked up the trunks, surprised by their weight, packed tight with whatever she'd valued enough to bring. "I travel light," she said, seeing his expression. "Easier to run." They loaded the luggage onto his horse, and Caleb helped Margaret mount behind him. She settled onto the saddle with her arms around his waist, and he could feel her warmth against his back, could feel the tension in her body like a drawn bowstring. The ride to his cabin took 40 minutes. Margaret didn't speak, just held on and looked at the landscape rolling past. Caleb wanted to say something to ease the awkwardness, to begin some kind of conversation that might help them understand each other. But words felt inadequate. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down and lit the lamp inside. Warm light filled the single room that was now supposed to be their home. Margaret walked slowly around the space, taking in every detail: the bed in the corner, the small stove, the table with 2 chairs, the shelves of books and supplies, sparse and plain and utterly inadequate for a woman who'd left everything she knew on the promise of safety. "It's not much," Caleb started to say. "It's perfect," Margaret interrupted. She turned to face him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something like a smile touched her scarred face. "No one knows I'm here. That's all that matters." She set her carpet bag on the table and opened it, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Caleb saw what he'd suspected: a knife. 4 inches of sharp steel that she'd been carrying since the moment she stepped off that train. "I need to be clear about something, Mr. Reed." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not the woman Thomas wrote to you about. I'm not who you think I am. You're Margaret Morrison. Yes, but there are things about me you don't know. Things I've done. Thomas knew some of it, but not all. And you deserve to know what you're taking on before we go any further." Caleb thought about Daniel, about his own secrets, about the truths he'd been too cowardly to share. "Then we're even. There are things about me you don't know either." Something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. 2 people with secrets meeting in a stranger's cabin, about to bind their lives together based on promises made by a man who couldn't answer for them. "This marriage," Margaret said slowly, "it's protection for me. Legal protection from Victor. That's all I'm asking. Can you offer that?" "I can. No questions about my past, about what I did, about why Victor wants me dead." The word dead hung in the air between them. Caleb heard everything she wasn't saying: the fear, the history, the violence that had sent her running 3,000 miles to marry a stranger. "We all have things we're not proud of," Caleb said quietly. "Things we'd change if we could. I'm not here to judge you, Margaret. I'm here to keep a promise and give you the protection you need." She studied him for a long moment, those dark eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or trustworthiness. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, decisive. "Then I accept. When can we marry?" "Tomorrow, if you want. There's a reverend in town. We'd need witnesses, but I can arrange that." "Tomorrow, then. The sooner it's legal, the safer I'll be." They talked logistics after that: sleeping arrangements for the night, food, practical matters that kept them from addressing anything deeper. Caleb offered her the bed and took the floor himself. Margaret didn't argue, just pulled a nightdress from her carpet bag and asked for privacy to change. Caleb stepped outside, letting the cool evening air clear his head. The stars were beginning to emerge in a sky that stretched impossibly wide. Somewhere out there, Victor Morrison might be searching for the woman currently changing into her nightclothes in Caleb's cabin. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably asking Mrs. Harlow when his papa would visit again. Somewhere in town, Thomas lay unconscious, unable to answer for the promise he'd extracted or explain what he'd known about Margaret's situation. And here was Caleb about to marry a woman he'd met 6 hours ago, taking on her secrets and her enemies and her desperate need for protection, all because he'd given his word to a dying friend. When he went back inside, Margaret was in the bed with the blankets pulled up to her chin. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, longer than he'd expected, dark and thick. The scars on her neck and shoulder were more visible now, but somehow she seemed less guarded this way, more human and real. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for meeting me today, for this, for all of it. You don't have to thank me for keeping my word. You'd be surprised how rare that actually is. Basic decency, I mean." She turned onto her side, facing the wall. Within minutes, her breathing had evened into sleep or something like it. But Caleb, lying on the floor near the stove, heard her wake several times in the night, heard her quiet movements as she checked the windows, the door, making sure everything was secure. The habits of someone who'd learned to sleep light and wake ready to run. He lay awake long after Margaret's breathing finally settled into real sleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about promises. About the one he'd made to Thomas, the one he'd made to Margaret, and the one he was breaking to both of them by not telling the truth about Daniel. Tomorrow they would marry. Tomorrow this strange arrangement would become legal and binding. Tomorrow he would take responsibility for another person's safety and future. And God help him, he had no idea if he was strong enough not to fail again. But he'd given his word. And Caleb Reed was a man of his word, even when they terrified him. Even when he didn't know how he'd make them work. Even when they required more than he thought he had to give. Outside, the night stretched quiet and cold. Inside, two wounded people tried to sleep under the same roof, both carrying secrets, both running from different kinds of pain, both hoping that maybe this impossible arrangement could become something worth having. Neither of them knew that 3 days from now, everything would change. That Margaret's past was closer than either of them suspected, that the man she thought she'd left behind was already on his way west, following a trail that would lead him straight to Caleb Reed's door. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they had made it this far. Margaret was safe. Caleb had kept his promise to Thomas. And in a frontier town in Wyoming territory that was as close to victory as either of them dared to hope for. The wedding took place the next morning in Reverend Martin's small church with Mrs. Peterson and her husband serving as witnesses. Margaret wore the same gray traveling dress she'd arrived in. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and his only suit jacket, smelling faintly of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored since Sarah's funeral. Reverend Martin kept the ceremony brief, perhaps sensing that neither bride nor groom wanted lengthy speeches about love and devotion they weren't pretending to feel. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Margaret's forehead quickly, formally, a seal on a contract more than an expression of affection. Mrs. Peterson tried to engage them in conversation afterward, curiosity bright in her eyes, but Margaret's polite terseness eventually drove her away. They walked back to the cabin in silence this time, as Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Reed, bound by law and vows that felt both terrifyingly real and strangely hollow. That evening, as the sun set and painted the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and gold, they sat at the small table eating the simple dinner Margaret had prepared. The silence between them had shifted somehow. No longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but something deeper. The weight of shared knowledge that their lives were now legally entwined. Margaret set down her fork and met Caleb's eyes across the table. "I need to ask you something difficult," she said. "Ask. If we made this marriage real, in every way, would Victor still have legal claim on me?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb understood what she was asking, what she was proposing. His throat went dry. "You're asking if we should consummate the marriage." "I'm asking if it would help, legally. If I carried your child, the law would see me as your wife, in truth, not just on paper. Victor couldn't claim I was still bound to him. He couldn't force me back to Pennsylvania as his property." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. "I know it's not romantic. I know it's purely practical. But would it work?" Caleb thought about it, trying to separate law from emotion, practicality from the thundering of his heart. "Yes, if you were pregnant with my child, no court would side with Victor. You'd be recognized as my wife under every definition. But Margaret, I'm not going to force you into anything. We can wait. We can figure out another way." "I don't want to wait." She looked down at her hands. "My whole life I've been terrified of men, of being touched. Victor made sure of that. But sitting here with you talking like this, I realize something. For the first time since I was 17 years old, I'm not afraid." The confession hit Caleb harder than he'd expected. He reached across the table, covering her trembling hands with his own. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Marriage is legal protection, whether or not we share a bed." "No, I want to." She turned her hands over, lacing her fingers through his. "Because this is my choice. Not Victor's, not obligation, mine. And because I trust you, Caleb Reed. I don't know why, but I do." They moved to the bed together as darkness fell outside. There was no poetry in it, no grand romance, just two damaged people choosing to be vulnerable with each other, choosing trust over fear, choosing to make real what had started as obligation. Margaret shook when Caleb touched her, but she didn't pull away. Caleb moved slowly, carefully, letting her set the pace, stopping whenever her breath caught with something that might be fear. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, not speaking. Margaret's head rested on Caleb's chest, his arm around her shoulders. He could feel her heart beating fast at first, then gradually slowing to something more peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being gentle, for giving me that." Caleb kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You don't need to thank me for basic decency." "Yes, I do, because it's rarer than you think." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and when nightmares woke Margaret twice before dawn, Caleb held her until the shaking stopped and sleep reclaimed her. Morning came with birdsong and pale sunlight filtering through the cabin windows. Caleb woke to find Margaret already up, standing at the stove making coffee. She'd braided her hair and changed into a simple blue dress, and when she heard him move, she turned with something that might almost be called a smile. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He sat up suddenly, aware of his own state of undress, reaching for his shirt. "You sleep all right after?" "Better than I have in months, actually." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to him. "I kept waiting to feel trapped, to regret it. But I don't. Is that strange?" "No, it's honest." He accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. "Margaret, I want you to know something. Last night, what we did, it doesn't mean you're trapped. If you want to leave, if this doesn't work out, you can go. I won't hold you against your will." She sat on the edge of the bed beside him, close, but not touching. "I believe you. That's why I'm staying." They ate breakfast together, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the conversation felt natural. Margaret asked about the ranch, about Caleb's work, about Wyoming winters, and what to expect. Caleb asked about Pennsylvania, about the textile mill, about how she'd learned to cook so well. And then, slowly, carefully, Margaret began to tell him the truth. "The mill fire," she said, staring into her coffee cup. "It wasn't an accident. I set it." Caleb went very still. "To kill Victor." "Yes, he owned the mill. He was there that day in his office on the top floor. I'd planned it for months, waiting for the right opportunity. I knew which machinery was most likely to spark. I knew where the oil was stored. I knew the exits. I thought I could set the fire, get out safely, and let everyone think it was an industrial accident." Her voice remained steady, but her hands were white-knuckled around the cup. 3 workers died. 3 workers died in that fire. 2 men I didn't know, and a woman named Ruth. I tried to warn them, but the fire spread too fast. Neither did 2 men on the 3rd floor. I killed them, Caleb. Maybe not directly, but their blood is on my hands. The confession sat between them, heavy and terrible. Caleb thought about judgment, about right and wrong, about the things desperation could drive a person to do. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you think killing him was the only way?" Margaret laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Because I tried everything else first. I went to the police. Victor owned them. I tried to leave. He found me and brought me back. I tried to fight. He broke 3 of my ribs and locked me in a room for 2 weeks. She touched the scars on her neck absently. "These burns, I got them escaping the fire I'd set. The building went up faster than I'd anticipated. I barely made it out. And for 2 years I thought Victor had died in those flames, thought I was free. But he didn't die. No, he survived. I don't know how. But 6 months ago, someone saw him in Philadelphia asking questions, looking for his wife. That's when I knew I had to disappear completely. That's when I started writing to Thomas." Caleb set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, look at me." When she did, he took her scarred hands in his. "I don't judge you for what you did. A man who beats his wife, who controls and terrorizes her, he forfeits his right to be treated with mercy. You did what you had to do to survive. And those workers who died, that's tragic, but it's not murder. It's an accident that happened while you were trying to save your own life. Tears spilled down her cheeks, the first he'd seen from her. You don't understand. I should have found another way. I should have tried harder. Those people had families, children, and they died because I was too cowardly to keep enduring. Enduring abuse isn't courage. It's just slow death. Caleb pulled her closer. You survived. You fought back. You escaped. That takes more strength than most people have. Don't you dare call yourself a coward. She collapsed against him, then crying in earnest, and Caleb held her while years of guilt and fear poured out. When the storm finally passed, she pulled back, wiping her eyes. There's more you should know about Thomas. What about him? He wasn't just a rancher writing to a lonely woman. He was an investigator. At least he used to be. Margaret took a shaking breath. Some of the mill workers hired him to investigate Victor to find proof of the unsafe conditions, the bribes to inspectors. Thomas found evidence, enough to destroy Victor, but Victor paid him off, paid him to disappear and stay quiet. The revelation hit Caleb like cold water. Thomas, his friend, the man he'd trusted completely, had taken bribes to hide evidence of crimes that eventually led to deaths. How do you know this? Thomas told me, not at first. We'd been writing for almost a year before he confessed. He said the guilt was eating him alive, that he'd spent the money but couldn't spend the shame. He said helping me escape was his way of making it right. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What did Thomas mean when he said, "Tell her I'm sorry about that night"? What night? Thomas's face went pale. The night I took Victor's money. I was supposed to meet with the mill workers, show them the evidence. Instead, I met Victor, took his bribe. And those workers kept working in unsafe conditions. 3 of them died 6 months later in the fire you set. That's the night I'm sorry for. Of redeeming himself for what he'd done. Caleb stood up, needing to move, needing to process. Thomas had manipulated them both, had orchestrated this entire situation out of guilt, using Caleb's loyalty and Margaret's desperation to ease his own conscience. Did you know about me? Caleb asked. Before you came here, did Thomas tell you he was planning to ask me to marry you if something happened to him? No, I thought I was coming to marry Thomas. Finding out he was unconscious, that you'd taken his place, that was as much a surprise to me as my past probably is to you. They stood on opposite sides of the small cabin, 2 people realizing they'd both been used by a man they'd trusted. The anger Caleb felt toward Thomas was complicated by the knowledge that his friend lay unconscious in town, possibly dying, unable to defend or explain himself. Where does that leave us? Margaret asked quietly. Caleb looked at her. This woman, who'd killed for her freedom, who'd traveled 3,000 miles on the promise of a stranger, who'd trusted him with her body and her darkest secrets, who was now his wife legally and in truth. It leaves us here, he said, making our own choices. Not Thomas's, not Victor's, ours. And what do you choose? I choose to protect you, to stand between you and whatever's coming, and to try to build something real out of this mess we've inherited. Margaret crossed the cabin and took his hands. Then I choose the same thing. And Caleb, whatever secrets you're keeping from me, whatever you haven't told me yet, I'm ready to hear them. No more lies between us. It was the perfect opening. The moment to tell her about Daniel, about Sarah, about all the ways he'd already failed at being what a family needed. Caleb opened his mouth to confess, and at that exact moment someone pounded on the cabin door. They both froze. Margaret's hand went to the knife she kept in her dress pocket. Caleb moved to the door, gesturing for Margaret to stay back. Who is it? It's Mrs. Harlow. Caleb, you need to come quick. It's Daniel. He's sick. The name meant nothing to Margaret, but Caleb went pale. He grabbed his coat and hat, then turned to Margaret. I have to go. There's something I need to deal with in town. Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Caleb, who's Daniel? But he was already out the door, mounting his horse, riding toward town with Mrs. Harlow following. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching them disappear, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. He'd kept something from her, something important, and she was about to find out what. Caleb made it to Mrs. Harlow's house in record time, his heart pounding with fear that had nothing to do with blizzards or promises. Daniel was all he had left of Sarah. If something happened to his son, if he lost him too, there would be nothing left of Caleb worth saving. He burst through the door to find Daniel in bed, small body burning with fever, cheeks flushed red, breathing fast and shallow. The boy's eyes were closed, but he tossed restlessly, mumbling words Caleb couldn't make out. How long has he been like this? Caleb knelt beside the bed, pressing his hand to Daniel's forehead. Hot, dangerously hot. Since last night. I gave him willow bark tea, tried to bring the fever down, but it's not working. I was going to send for the doctor, but I wanted to tell you first. Caleb brushed Daniel's sweat-soaked hair back from his forehead. Daniel, can you hear me? It's Papa. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Papa, my throat hurts. I know, son, I know. Caleb looked at Mrs. Harlow. Send for Dr. Harrison and bring me cool water and cloth. We need to bring this fever down. What he didn't hear was the sound of a horse arriving outside. Didn't know that Margaret, unable to stay locked in the cabin while her new husband raced off to help someone named Daniel, had followed at a distance. Didn't realize she was about to walk in and discover the secret he'd been too cowardly to share. Margaret tied her horse next to Caleb's and approached the small house cautiously. Through the window, she could see Caleb kneeling beside a bed, his back to her, his whole body radiating tension. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The scene that met her eyes made her stop short. Caleb holding a wet cloth to a small boy's forehead, speaking in low, gentle tones, acting like a father. Caleb, her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Who is this? He turned, and the guilt on his face told her everything she needed to know even before he spoke. Margaret, I can explain. Explain who this child is, why you ran out of our cabin the moment you heard his name. She stepped closer, looking at the boy. 5 years old, maybe 6. Dark hair, brown eyes, Caleb's eyes. Oh God, he's yours, isn't he? This is Daniel, my son. The words hit her like a physical blow. Son. Caleb had a son. A child he'd never mentioned in his letters, never told her about, never thought to share before he'd married her and taken her to his bed. You have a child. Her voice was flat, dangerous. You married me, you slept with me, and you didn't think that was information I should have. I was going to tell you. I just needed to wait for the right time. The right time. When would that have been, Caleb? After I was pregnant, after I was trapped. Mrs. Harlow, reading the situation with practiced wisdom, quietly excused herself. I'll fetch the doctor. After she left the cabin, fell into terrible silence, broken only by Daniel's labored breathing. The boy had fallen back into fevered sleep, unaware of the confrontation happening over his bed. Margaret looked at the child, then at Caleb. How old is he? 5. And his mother, Sarah. My wife, she died 3 years ago. Childbirth. The baby died too. The information kept coming, each revelation, another piece of the life Caleb had hidden from her. So you're a widower, with a son, living with someone else because you can't or won't you take care of him yourself. It's not that simple. Then explain it to me. Make me understand why you lied. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything. That's the same thing. Margaret's voice rose and Daniel stirred. She lowered it again, but the fury remained. You asked me to be honest with you, to tell you everything, to not keep secrets, and all the while you were hiding a whole child from me. Caleb stood moving away from the bed so they wouldn't wake Daniel. I was afraid. If I told you you wouldn't come, you'd decide the situation was too complicated, and you needed to get away from Victor. You needed safety. That mattered more than full disclosure. That wasn't your decision to make. You took away my choice. You let me walk into this marriage blind. You're right. You're absolutely right. I should have told you. But Margaret, if I had, would you have come? The question hung between them. Margaret wanted to say yes, wanted to claim she would have come anyway, that honesty mattered more than convenience. But the truth was more complicated. If Caleb had written about having a child, about being a widower who couldn't even raise his own son, would she have trusted him? Would she have believed he could protect her when he couldn't protect his own family? I don't know, she said finally, but I deserved the chance to decide. Daniel made a small sound, and both their heads turned. The boy's eyes had opened, fever bright and confused. Papa, who's the lady? Caleb returned to the bedside, taking Daniel's small hand in his. This is Margaret. She's my wife now. Like Mama was? The innocent question drove a knife into Caleb's heart. Yes, like Mama was. Daniel looked at Margaret with those fever-glazed eyes. "Are you going to go away too?" Margaret looked at the sick child, at Caleb's guilty face, and felt her anger war with compassion. She'd been lied to, deceived, brought into a situation she hadn't agreed to, but this boy hadn't lied. This boy had just lost his mother, barely saw his father, and now was sick and frightened. She could walk away, should walk away. Victor was coming anyway. Why stay with a man who'd started their marriage with deception? Then Daniel coughed small and weak, and Margaret saw herself at that age, alone, scared, needing someone to stay when everyone left. The anger didn't disappear, but it shifted, making room for something else. Choice. She could choose to stay. Not because she forgave Caleb yet, but because this child needed her. And maybe that was enough for now. The question asked in a child's voice, rough with sickness, cut through Margaret's anger like a blade. This wasn't just about Caleb's deception. This was about a little boy who'd lost his mother, who barely saw his father, who'd learned that the people you loved could disappear. She moved to the other side of the bed, ignoring Caleb's surprised look, and knelt down so she was at Daniel's eye level. "No," she said firmly, "I'm not going away, and neither is your papa. We're both staying right here. Promise." Margaret thought about promises, about how cheap they could be, how easily broken, about how this child had probably heard promises before that hadn't been kept. She met his fevered gaze steadily. "I promise, but right now you need to rest and get better." "Can you do that for me?" Daniel nodded weakly and closed his eyes again. Margaret stood and turned to Caleb. "We're going to have a very long conversation about honesty and trust and marriage, but not now. Now we focus on getting your son well." Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. "You're staying. I made a promise to a sick child. I gave my word." She moved to where Mrs. Harlow had left supplies. "Do you know basic nursing? Because I learned some things in the mill. We can bring this fever down if we're careful." They worked together through the afternoon and into evening. Cool cloths on Daniel's forehead, wrists, and neck. Small sips of water whenever he woke. Willow bark tea for the pain and fever. Margaret's hands were steady and sure, and Caleb found himself following her lead, watching how she touched Daniel, gently spoke to him, calmly treated him with a combination of medical efficiency and genuine care. Dr. Harrison arrived at dusk and examined Daniel thoroughly. "Fever from an infection," he pronounced. "Throat most likely. Nothing immediately dangerous if we manage it properly. Keep doing what you're doing. The fever should break in a day or two." After the doctor left, Caleb and Margaret continued their vigil. Daniel woke periodically, confused and frightened. Margaret was there each time, speaking softly, explaining where he was and that he was safe. By the third time, Daniel reached for her hand when he woke, and something in Caleb's chest cracked open. Near midnight, with Daniel finally sleeping peacefully and the fever beginning to ease, Caleb and Margaret sat together in Mrs. Harlow's small parlor. The anger from earlier had faded into something more complicated. Hurt, confusion, but also a strange understanding. "Tell me about her," Margaret said quietly. "About Sarah." Caleb stared into the cold fireplace. "We married young. I was 26, she was 23. She wanted children, lots of them. A big, warm family. Daniel was born a year after we married, beautiful, healthy. Sarah was so happy." He paused, the memories painful even after 3 years. "The doctor warned us, said another pregnancy might be risky. Sarah's first labor had been difficult. But Sarah wanted Daniel to have siblings, and I wanted to give her what she wanted. So we tried again. And she died. She screamed for 14 hours before the end came, begged me to make it stop. The baby was breech. The doctor couldn't turn it. When it was over, Sarah was gone, and the baby girl she'd wanted so badly was dead too. I held them both while they cooled, my wife and daughter, gone because I'd been selfish enough to want more." Margaret reached across the space between them and took his hand. "It wasn't your fault. I put her through that pregnancy knowing the risks. She chose it too. You said she wanted more children. That was her choice, Caleb. Her body, her decision. You didn't kill her. Biology did. Bad luck did. The limitations of frontier medicine did. But you didn't." The absolution in her voice was almost too much to bear. I couldn't look at Daniel afterward without seeing everything I destroyed. Every time he asked for Mama, every time he cried, I saw Sarah dying. So I sent him to Mrs. Harlow, told myself it was temporary, that I'd bring him home when I could handle it. That was 3 years ago. And you still can't handle it. How can I? How can I be a father when I've already proven I can't keep people safe, when I've already failed at the most basic thing a husband is supposed to do? Margaret squeezed his hand harder. By trying anyway, by being there even when it hurts, by choosing to love him despite the fear. She paused. I lost everything too, Caleb. Family future, the children I might have had. I thought my life was over, but sitting here watching you with Daniel, I realized something. Maybe it's not over. Maybe it's just different than we planned. What are you saying? I'm saying bring him home. Bring Daniel to live with us. Let me help you raise him. Let me have this chance at being part of a family again. Caleb looked at her. This woman he'd married out of obligation, who'd shared his bed out of practical necessity, who had every right to be furious about his deception. After everything I just put you through, you'd do that. You'd take on a child that isn't yours. I made a promise to a little boy that I wouldn't leave. I made a vow. And besides, her voice softened, he's yours. That makes him mine too now. Something shifted between them in that moment, something deeper than legal vows or physical intimacy, a choosing of each other that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the kind of partnership they'd both claimed to want. They stayed at Mrs. Harlow's that night, taking turns watching Daniel. By morning, the fever had broken completely, and the boy woke lucid and asking for breakfast. When he saw Caleb and Margaret sitting together beside his bed, his face lit up with uncomplicated joy. Papa, you stayed? Of course I stayed. Caleb gathered his son into his arms, holding him close. I'll always stay. And Daniel, I need to tell you something. Margaret and I got married. She's going to be living with us now. At the ranch, Daniel looked at Margaret with shy hope. Are you going to be my new mama? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. If you'd like me to be. I'd like that. Daniel smiled, and it was like watching sunshine break through storm clouds. Can I come home with you and Papa? Yes. Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, you're coming home. Today, right now. No more waiting. They packed Daniel's few belongings and said goodbye to Mrs. Harlow, who wept openly as she hugged the boy she'd cared for 3 years. Then the three of them rode back to the cabin together, Daniel sitting in front of Caleb on the saddle, chattering happily about everything he wanted to show Margaret, all the games he knew how to play, all the stories he could tell. Margaret rode behind them, watching father and son together, and felt something warm unfold in her chest, something that might eventually become happiness. The next 2 weeks, late March into early April, passed in a blur of domestic adjustment. Daniel moved into the cabin, sleeping on a small cot Caleb built in the corner. The space that had felt cramped for 2 people somehow expanded to accommodate 3. Margaret proved to be a natural, with children, patient with Daniel's endless questions, and energy firm when he tested boundaries, gentle when he had nightmares about his mother. Caleb watched his wife and son together and fell in love in the slow, quiet way of a man who'd forgotten he was capable of such feelings. The way Margaret braided Daniel's hair in the mornings, the way she read to him at night, her scarred fingers tracing the words, the way she sang softly while cooking dinner and Daniel would hum along. They became a family without planning it, without meaning to, simply by choosing each other day after day. One afternoon during that second week, Margaret rode into town for supplies and encountered a thin girl of about 10 hovering outside the general store. The child's dress was patched and repatched. Her face bore a fresh bruise along her cheekbone, and she flinched when Margaret approached. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked gently. The girl's eyes filled with tears. "My pa gets angry when he drinks. Ma says I should stay outside when he's like that." Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew that fear, had lived it herself for years with Victor. "What's your name?" "Emma Willis." When Caleb came to collect Margaret an hour later, she insisted they visit the Willis home. Jim Willis answered the door, already drunk despite the early afternoon. Behind him, a woman with hollow eyes clutched 2 younger children. "Your daughter was at the store," Margaret said, her voice steady but hard, with a bruise on her face. "My daughter's none of your concern," Jim slurred. Caleb stepped forward, and something in his posture changed, became dangerous. "She's a child in our town. That makes her everyone's concern. You lay hands on that girl again, you answer to me. Understood?" Jim's face darkened with drunken rage, but something in Caleb's eyes made him step back. He muttered a curse and slammed the door. From that day forward, Emma came to the cabin most afternoons. Margaret taught her letters, arithmetic, simple sewing. The girl was sharp, hungry for knowledge, desperate for somewhere safe. And Margaret saw in Emma the girl she'd once been, the one who'd needed someone to stand between her and violence. Caleb watched his wife with the frightened child and fell even deeper in love. Margaret wasn't just surviving anymore. She was saving someone else the way she'd needed to be saved. But peace in Wyoming territory was never guaranteed to last, and Margaret's past was closer than any of them knew. Meanwhile, in town, Thomas Brennan's eyes opened for the first time in 8 weeks. Dr. Harrison nearly dropped his stethoscope. "Easy. You've been unconscious 2 months." "How long?" Thomas croaked. 8 weeks since the blizzard." Memory flooded back. The storm. Caleb's promise. "Where's Caleb? Did Margaret come?" "They're married. 6 weeks ago." Relief, then terror. "Victor Morrison. Is he here yet?" "Who's Victor?" Thomas grabbed Harrison's wrist. "Send for Caleb. Now." "Victor's coming for Margaret. There are things they need to know, things I should have told them." "You're not well enough?" "Now?" "Victor Morrison is dangerous. If he finds her first." Thomas's voice broke. "Please." Harrison sent his assistant to the ranch immediately, but by the time the message arrived, Victor had already made his move. It was Jake Wilson who brought the news. He rode up to the ranch 2 weeks after Daniel had moved in, his expression grim. "Caleb, need to talk to you, private." They walked away from the cabin out of earshot. Margaret watched from the window, holding Daniel's hand, sensing trouble. "There's a man in town," Jake said without preamble. "Arrived yesterday on the stage. Well-dressed, well-spoken. Says he's looking for his wife. A woman with burn scars who came from Pennsylvania." Caleb's blood went cold. "Victor Morrison." Didn't give a name, but he's asking questions, talking to folks, being real polite about it. Says his wife is unwell, needs medical care. Most people are sympathetic. "Where is he now?" "Took a room at the hotel." "But Caleb, there's something else he knows about you and Margaret, about the marriage." "Someone must have told him." Caleb cursed softly. In a small town, secrets were impossible to keep. Someone had talked, and now Victor Morrison knew exactly where his wife had gone and who she'd married. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked. "Keep eyes on him. Find out what his plans are. And Jake, if he comes near my property, you come get me." That evening, after Daniel was asleep, Caleb told Margaret what Jake had said. He watched the color drain from her face, watched fear replace the peace she'd found over the past 2 weeks. "He's here," she whispered. "He found me. And you're my wife now. Legally. In every way. He has no claim on you. You don't understand what he's capable of. Laws don't matter to Victor. Money matters. Power matters. And he has both." Caleb pulled her close. "Then he's about to learn that some things money can't buy. You're under my protection now. Mine and the law's. He can't just take you." But even as he said it, Caleb felt the weight of what was coming. Victor Morrison hadn't traveled 3,000 miles to be politely turned away. The man Margaret had tried to kill was here in Wyoming looking for his wife. And the reckoning they'd both been hoping to avoid was finally at hand. The storm was coming, and this time no amount of promises would be enough to stop it. Victor Morrison arrived at the ranch 3 days later, alone and unarmed, presenting himself as nothing more threatening than a concerned husband searching for his troubled wife. He rode up in broad daylight, sitting straight in the saddle, dressed in expensive clothes that looked absurdly out of place against Wyoming's rough landscape. Caleb saw him coming from half a mile away and sent Daniel inside with instructions to stay with Margaret no matter what. Then he stood in front of his cabin rifle, held loose but ready, and waited. Victor dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who'd never had reason to fear violence. He was tall, well-built, with graying hair, and a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. Burn scars marked his hands and disappeared under his collar, proof that Margaret's fire had touched him after all. "Mr. Reed, I presume?" Victor's voice was cultured Eastern, carrying the accent of old money and older privilege. "I apologize for the unexpected visit. My name is Victor Morrison. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have a wife, legally married. Nothing about her belongs to you. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. You see, Margaret was already married when she wed you. That makes your union invalid. Bigamy, I believe they call it, quite illegal even out here in the wilderness. Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. Margaret told me about you, about what you did to her, about why she ran. Did she tell you she tried to murder me, that she set fire to my factory, killing 3 innocent workers in the process? Did she mention she's wanted for arson and manslaughter in Pennsylvania? Victor smiled cold and sharp. I thought not. My wife is many things, Mr. Reed, but honest isn't one of them. She's not your wife anymore. The law would disagree. And speaking of law, I have witnesses. I have evidence. I have everything I need to have Margaret arrested and returned to Pennsylvania to face justice for what she did, unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement. The word arrangement hung in the air like poison. Caleb had dealt with men like Victor before. Men who thought everything had a price, everyone could be bought. What kind of arrangement? Simple. You let Margaret come home with me quietly and without fuss, and I'll forget all about the fraud of your marriage. I'll even compensate you for your trouble. Say $500. That's generous for a few weeks of inconvenience. Behind Caleb, the cabin door opened. Margaret stepped out, Daniel clinging to her skirt, his small face frightened but determined. She'd put on her best dress, pinned her hair up, made herself presentable for the confrontation she'd known was coming. "Hello, Victor," she said, her voice steady, despite the terror Caleb could see in her eyes. "It's been a long time." Victor's expression shifted when he saw her, something predatory and possessive that made Caleb's skin crawl. "Margaret, my dear, you look well. Wyoming agrees with you. I'm not coming back. That's not your decision to make. You're my wife. You belong to me, and you're going to come home and face the consequences of what you did. I'm Caleb's wife now. The marriage is legal and consummated. You have no claim on me." Victor's smile widened. "Consummated? How interesting. Tell me, Margaret, did you mention to your cowboy that I'm still very much alive, that our marriage was never dissolved because, if you did, then he knowingly committed bigamy? If you didn't, then you're guilty of fraud. Either way, this marriage is invalid." Margaret stepped forward, moving away from Daniel, putting herself between the boy and her past. "What do you want, Victor? Why travel 3,000 miles for a wife you never loved? Let me go. Find someone else to control." "Because you're mine. You've always been mine, and no one takes what belongs to Victor Morrison and gets away with it. Not even you." He turned his attention to Caleb. "Last chance, cowboy. $500, and you walk away clean, or I bring the law down on both of you, and you lose everything. Your wife, your reputation, possibly your freedom. Choose wisely." And Caleb thought about Daniel inside the cabin, about the life they'd started to build, about Margaret's trust, and the promises he'd made. Then he thought about Thomas, lying unconscious in town, about the secrets and lies that had brought them all to this moment. "No," he said simply. "Margaret stays. You leave. And if you come near my family again, we'll have a different kind of conversation." Victor's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "That's a threat. That's a promise. And I won't break faith." For a moment, tension stretched tight enough to snap. Then Victor laughed, genuinely amused. "How noble! How admirably stupid! Very well, Mr. Reed, have it your way, but know this. I have lawyers, I have money, and I have evidence of every crime your wife committed. By the end of the week, there will be warrants for her arrest, federal warrants, and when the marshals come, your frontier honor won't protect her. Neither will your empty threats." He mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, taking his time, making clear he wasn't retreating out of fear. "I'll give you 1 day to reconsider. After that, the law takes over. Good day, Mrs. Morrison. I'll see you very soon." He rode away at a leisurely pace, and Caleb watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, to lower the rifle, to turn and face Margaret. She stood frozen, her face pale, one hand pressed to her mouth. When Caleb reached for her, she collapsed against him, shaking so hard he thought she might fly apart. "He's going to destroy us," she whispered. "Everything we've built, everyone I've brought into this, he's going to burn it all down." Let him try. But even as Caleb said it, doubt crept in. Victor had lawyers and money and the weight of Eastern law behind him. What did Caleb have? a questionable marriage, a woman accused of arson and murder, and a promise made in a blizzard that was looking more impossible by the moment. That night, after Daniel was asleep and the cabin was dark, Caleb and Margaret sat at the table and faced the truth neither wanted to speak aloud. "We need evidence," Margaret said. "Real evidence of Victor's crimes. The embezzlement, the bribery, the unsafe conditions that led to the fire. If we can prove he's the real criminal, it doesn't matter what I did." "That evidence is in Pennsylvania. 3 days by train. Victor's here. We can't just leave." "Then I'll go alone. You stay with Daniel, keep him safe. I can get to Victor's office, break into his safe. I know the combination. I used to live in that house, remember?" Caleb stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're suggesting you go back to Pennsylvania, break into the home of a man who wants you arrested or dead, steal documents, and somehow make it back here before Victor realizes what you've done?" "Yes. That's suicide. It's the only chance we have. If we don't get that evidence, I'm going to prison or worse. At least this way we fight back." "No. If we do this, we do it together. Jake can watch Daniel. We both go, we both fight." "Caleb, that's too dangerous. If something happens to both of us, what happens to Daniel?" The question hung between them, terrible and necessary. But Caleb had made his choice the moment he'd promised to protect Margaret. He wasn't abandoning her now. "We go together," he said firmly. "We get the evidence together. We survive together. That's partnership, Margaret. That's what marriage means." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Together, then. Early May." They left 2 days later after making arrangements with Jake Wilson to watch over Daniel. The parting nearly broke Caleb's heart. Daniel clung to him, crying, begging him not to go. "I have to, son, but I'll come back. I promise I'll come back. Mama said she'd come back too, but she didn't." The words cut deeper than any knife. Caleb knelt down, taking Daniel's small face in his hands. "Listen to me. Your mama loved you more than anything. She didn't choose to leave you. But I'm choosing to come back. I will come back. Do you believe me?" Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face. Margaret knelt beside them, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. "We'll both come back," she promised. "And when we do, we'll never have to run again. Never have to be afraid. We'll be a real family forever. Can you be brave until then?" "I'll try." They rode out at dawn, catching the train south from the nearest depot. The journey to Pennsylvania took 3 days of rattling travel, sleeping in uncomfortable seats, eating cold food, and watching the landscape shift from open prairie to eastern cities. Margaret grew more tense with each mile, her hand never far from the knife she kept hidden in her dress. On the train, in the quiet hours when other passengers slept, she told Caleb everything, about her childhood in poverty, about Victor's courtship that had seemed like salvation, about the wedding night when she'd discovered his true nature, about the years of abuse, isolation, and fear, about the moment she'd decided burning down his factory was preferable to one more day in hell. Caleb listened without judgment, holding her hand while the train carried them toward the past she'd tried so hard to escape. They arrived in Philadelphia on a gray afternoon that smelled of coal smoke and industry. The city felt oppressive after Wyoming's open spaces, buildings crowding too close, people everywhere, noise and dirt, and the constant press of humanity. Margaret pulled her veil down, hiding her face. "Victor's factory is on the east side. His house is 3 blocks from there. We'll go at night when the servants are asleep." They spent the day in a cheap boarding house, planning and waiting. As darkness fell, they made their way through streets Margaret knew by heart, staying in shadows, avoiding main thoroughfares. The house, when they reached it, was exactly as she'd described. 3 stories of brick and privileged windows, dark except for a few rooms on the upper floor. "The servants' entrance is around back," Margaret whispered. "The lock is old. I can pick it." She could. Within minutes they were inside, moving through dark hallways toward Victor's study. Margaret's hands were steady as she approached the safe hidden behind a portrait of Victor's father. She spun the combination lock with practiced ease, and the door swung open. Inside, files and documents were organized with meticulous care. Margaret began pulling them out, scanning contents by lamplight. Ledgers showing embezzlement, letters proving bribery of factory inspectors, records of unsafe machinery purchases made to save money despite knowing the risks. "This is it," she breathed. "This is everything we need." Then from behind them, slow applause echoed through the room. They spun to find Victor standing in the doorway, flanked by two large men. He was smiling, pleased with himself like a cat who'd just cornered a mouse. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this, Margaret? I've known you for 10 years. I know how you think. I knew you'd come for these documents, so I waited. And you walked right into my trap." Caleb moved in front of Margaret, his hand going to the gun at his belt. But Victor's men were faster, already armed, already aimed. "I wouldn't do that, Cowboy. My associates are excellent shots. They'll put you down before you clear leather." Victor stepped further into the room. "Here's what's going to happen. Margaret is coming with me. You're going back to Wyoming if you're smart. If you're not, well, accidents happen in big cities all the time. People disappear. No one asks questions. I'm not leaving without her." "Then you're a fool, but a dead fool, which is at least entertaining." Victor nodded to his men. "Kill him. Make it look like a robbery." The men raised their guns. Caleb tensed, knowing he couldn't draw fast enough, couldn't save Margaret, couldn't keep the promise he'd made to Daniel. This was how it ended. In a stranger's study, dying for a woman he'd known less than 2 months, failing one more time. Then Margaret moved. She grabbed the oil lamp from Victor's desk and threw it at the nearest gunman. Glass shattered. Oil sprayed. Flame caught instantly, spreading faster than anyone expected. The man screamed, dropping his gun to beat at the fire consuming his jacket. In the chaos, Caleb drew and fired. Not to kill, but to create more confusion. The bullet shattered a window. The second gunman turned toward the sound, and Margaret was on him, her hidden knife flashing. She drove it into his shoulder, and he went down cursing. Victor lunged for Margaret, but she was already moving, grabbing Caleb's hand, pulling him toward the door. They ran through the house, while behind them fire spread with terrifying speed. The old wood caught easily, flames racing up curtains and across floors. They burst out the servants' entrance into night air thick with smoke. Behind them, the house was already burning, windows, glowing orange, servants screaming as they fled. Victor stumbled out moments later, his face twisted with rage. "Margaret," he roared. "I'll find you. I'll never stop. You're mine." But they were already running, disappearing into the maze of Philadelphia's streets, leaving Victor and his burning house behind. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing in an alley blocks away. "Did you get the documents?" Caleb gasped. Margaret pulled folded papers from inside her dress. "Some of them. Not all. But enough, I think. Enough to prove what he is. They'd done it. They'd gotten evidence. But at what cost? Margaret had set another fire, destroyed another building, and Victor was alive, angrier than ever, with even more reason to hunt them down. The journey back to Wyoming felt endless. Every station, every stop, Caleb expected to see marshals waiting, expected Victor to appear with law and guns and the full weight of his fury. But the train rolled west without incident, carrying them home to whatever consequences awaited. They arrived back at the ranch to find Jake waiting, with news that hit like a thunderbolt. "Thomas is awake. Woke up 3 days ago. He's been asking for you both." Thomas Brennan sat propped up in a hospital bed, looking 20 years older than the last time Caleb had seen him conscious. The injuries had healed, but something in his eyes spoke of damage that went deeper than flesh. "Caleb." "Margaret." His voice was rough from months of disuse. "I heard you got married. That's good. That's what I wanted." "Why?" Caleb demanded. "Why did you set all this up? Why manipulate us both?" Thomas looked away, shame written across his weathered face. "Because I was a coward. Victor paid me $10,000 to bury evidence against him. $10,000, and I took it. Spent it. Lived with the guilt for 2 years. When I heard he was hunting for Margaret, I knew I had to fix what I'd broken. Had to help her escape. So you orchestrated our marriage. Used your injury, your supposed dying request, to force us together." "I thought I was dying. I genuinely believed that. And yes, I asked you to marry Margaret because I knew you'd protect her better than I ever could. I knew you were a good man, Caleb, better than me. I knew if anyone could keep her safe, it was you." "You used us," Margaret said quietly, "used our fear and desperation for your redemption. Yes, and I'm sorry, but was I wrong? Look at you. You're married. You're together. You've built something real. Would that have happened if I told the truth from the start?" The question had no good answer. Caleb and Margaret looked at each other, thinking about all the ways they'd come together. The lies and truths tangled so completely it was impossible to separate them. "We have evidence now," Margaret said, "against Victor, documents proving his embezzlement and bribery, but it's not complete. Do you have anything from when you investigated him?" Thomas's eyes widened. "I kept copies. Insurance in case Victor ever tried to silence me. They're hidden at my old boarding house. If you combine what you have with what I saved, it should be enough to destroy him." They retrieved Thomas's documents that same day. Combined with what Margaret had stolen, they had proof of years of criminal activity. Embezzlement, bribery, safety violations, witness intimidation, enough to send Victor Morrison to prison for decades. But Victor wasn't in Pennsylvania anymore. According to the telegraph from Eastern Marshals, his house had burned to the ground and he'd disappeared. No one knew where he'd gone. Caleb knew. Victor was coming to Wyoming, coming to finish what he'd started, coming for Margaret with nothing left to lose. The final confrontation came on a cold morning 2 weeks later. Daniel was at Jake's house for safety. Margaret and Caleb were fortifying the ranch, preparing for siege, when Victor appeared on the ridge. But he wasn't alone this time. He'd brought men. 6 of them armed and hard-looking, the kind of hired guns who'd do anything for money. They surrounded the property, cutting off escape. Victor rode forward alone, stopping just within shouting distance. "Last chance, Margaret. Come with me now, and I'll let your cowboy and his boy live. Refuse, and I burn this place down with everyone in it." Caleb checked his rifle, calculating odds. 6 men plus Victor, 2 defenders. The mathematics of violence were brutally simple. "He means it," Margaret said. "He'll destroy everything we've built. He always does." "Then we fight." "No." She stood, putting down her weapon. "I'll go with him. I'll end this." "Margaret, no. It's the only way to keep you safe, to keep Daniel safe." She cupped his face in her scarred hands. "I love you, Caleb Reed. I didn't expect to, but I do. And because I love you, I won't let you die for me." She stepped toward the door and Caleb grabbed her arm. "If you walk out there, he'll kill you anyway." "I know, but at least you and Daniel will live." Before Caleb could stop her, she pulled free and walked outside, hands raised, surrendering herself to the man she'd tried twice to kill. Victor dismounted, triumph written across his face. He approached Margaret slowly, savoring his victory. "You should have stayed with me," he said softly. "Should have accepted your place. Now you'll die knowing you destroyed everyone you tried to protect." He raised his gun, pointing it at Margaret's heart, and Caleb, watching through the window, realized he was about to witness the woman he loved murdered in front of him, powerless to stop it. Then thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky, except it wasn't thunder. It was hoofbeats, dozens of them. Caleb looked up to see riders pouring over the ridge, Jake Wilson leading them. Ranch hands from Broken Creek. Townspeople who'd grown to respect Margaret. Even the sheriff badge gleaming in morning light. Victor spun his hired guns, raising weapons, but they were outnumbered 3-1. The sheriff rode forward, paper in hand. "Victor Morrison, you're under arrest for embezzlement, bribery, arson, attempted murder, and about 15 other charges. Drop your weapon." For a moment, Caleb thought Victor might fight anyway, might pull the trigger out of pure spite. But survival instinct won over revenge. He lowered the gun, face twisting with rage and disbelief. The hired men scattered, not willing to die for money that would never be paid. Victor stood alone, watching his final plan crumble, and in his eyes Caleb saw something terrible. Not defeat, not surrender. Madness. Victor raised his gun again, pointing it at Margaret. "If I can't have you, no one will." The shot that rang out didn't come from Victor's gun. It came from Margaret's hand, the knife she'd kept hidden. She'd thrown it with desperate accuracy, and it buried itself in Victor's shoulder. His gun fired wild, the bullet going high and harmless. He staggered, clutching the wound, staring at Margaret with something like respect. "You finally fought back," he said. "Took you long enough." Then the sheriff's men were on him, wrestling him down, binding his hands. It was over. Finally, truly over. Margaret collapsed, and Caleb was there to catch her, holding her while she shook with reaction. Around them, the posse secured the scene, but Caleb barely noticed. He held his wife and whispered promises against her hair. Promises that this time he could keep. August 1885. 3 months after Victor's arrest, Caleb stood on his porch watching the sun set over land that was finally legally his. Samuel Garrett had made him full partner in the ranch before passing peacefully in his sleep. The operation was thriving under Caleb's management. Inside the expanded cabin, Margaret was putting Daniel to bed. Her belly was round with their child due in another 3 months. They'd decided to name the baby Hope if it was a girl, Thomas if it was a boy. A nod to the man who'd manipulated them together, but given them, despite everything, a chance at happiness. Thomas himself lived in a small cabin on the property, helping with ranch work when his health allowed. He and Caleb had rebuilt their friendship slowly, carefully, on a foundation of honesty this time. It would never be what it was before, but it was real, and that mattered more. Emma Willis had come to live with them after her father died. Her mother had remarried, and Emma was thriving under Margaret's teaching. She and Daniel had become inseparable siblings in everything but blood. Victor Morrison was in prison serving 30 years for his crimes. The evidence Margaret and Thomas had gathered, combined with testimony from factory workers, had been overwhelming. He would die behind bars, no longer a threat to anyone. Margaret stepped onto the porch, settling beside Caleb with a contented sigh. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Promises. How they can trap you or free you depending on how you keep them." And which kind did we have? Caleb thought about it. About the promise he'd made in a blizzard to a dying friend. About the vows he'd spoken in a church to a scarred stranger. About all the ways those promises had led them here to this porch, this moment, this life. "Both," he said. "They trapped us together, then they freed us to choose each other." Margaret took his hand, placing it on her belly where their child moved. "I'm glad we were trapped. I'm glad you kept that promise. So am I." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged. Inside, Daniel and Emma were laughing about something. Thomas was reading by lamplight. Life continued in all its messy, complicated, beautiful normalcy. The promise made in snow and blood had become something neither Caleb nor Margaret could have anticipated. Not just marriage, not just survival, but a family built from broken pieces. A life worth living, worth fighting for, worth choosing every single day. Some promises were kept in desperation, but the best ones, the ones that mattered most, were kept in daylight, in laughter, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Caleb had promised to protect Margaret, to give her the life Thomas couldn't. He'd kept that promise, but along the way, they'd both discovered something more valuable than safety or obligation. They'd discovered that two people with nothing but scars and secrets could build something worth having. That love, earned through honesty and shared struggle, meant more than romance born from easy circumstances. That family was something you chose, not something you were given. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Margaret leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. His hand stayed on her belly, feeling the life they'd created together. "Tell me again," she said softly. "Tell you what? That you choose this, that you choose us." Caleb turned her face toward his, kissing her with all the tenderness he'd learned to feel again. "I choose this," he said. "I choose you, Daniel, this baby, this life. Not because I promised Thomas, not because you needed protection, because this is where I want to be. With you, always." Margaret smiled, and in that smile, Caleb saw their entire future, the children they'd raise, the ranch they'd build, the years they'd spend choosing each other day after day through whatever storms came. The promise made in snow had become a promise renewed in sunshine, and that Caleb thought was the best kind of promise there was, the kind you kept not because you had to, but because you wanted to, because the person you'd promised was worth every sacrifice, every fear, overcome every moment of choosing love over safety. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Ahead, Wyoming stretched vast and wild. And between those 2 points, past and future, Caleb and Margaret built their present, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one promise kept after another. The end.